All right, hi everybody. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about national parks. And if you're like me, you probably assumed that anything in a national park would be protected and then it would be there forever. But hopefully you understand now that these national parks and other parks are ecological islands. And as we all know at this point in the course, that ecological islands are impacted by things that happen outside of their borders, such as edge effects. But first, let's start with a little bit of history, particularly on Yellowstone. Yellowstone was America's first national park, and in fact, it was the first national park in the entire world. And so this is a painting of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, so not the Grand Canyon in Arizona, but a place called the Grand Canyon in Yellowstone, by Thomas Moran in 1872. And 1872 was a year that Yellowstone was established as a national park. And 1872 was also the year that Yellowstone was established as a national park. And the United States Congress established the National Park Act in 1872, and that's when Yellowstone became America's and the world's first national park. Then the National Park Protection Act of 1872 kind of broke the established policy of transferring public lands in the West to private ownership. But the idea at the time was not the conservation of the parks. The parks were to be monuments of nature, these spectacular places to compete with the monuments and the cathedrals of Europe. And in fact, the last bison disappeared about 10 years after Yellowstone was established. The original parks were managed independently by different organizations having different degrees of success. So in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson established the National Park Service to consolidate the management of America's parklands under one agency. And the National Park Service today manages over 84 million acres across the United States and its territories. And it serves as a model for countries around the world. The National Park Service Organic Act of 1916 was established, and the act states that the fundamental purpose of the park is to, quote, conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment in the same manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired. So that this concept of park management was to somehow manage the parks in a way to create an illusion of primitive America. But many things have changed since this act in 1916. And there's many events, there are many factors affecting wildlife that did not exist in the pre-15th century before Europeans arrived to what is now the United States. Parks are affected by factors that didn't exist in the 15th century and on. So there's absence of natural fire regimes, both due to Smokey the Bear policies and now these very large wildfire superfires because of fire suppression. Climate change is also a problem. Exotic species in many of the parks are a problem. The prevalence of new diseases that affect wildlife are a problem, and plants within the park. Invasive species of plants in the park that lack natural apex predators. Heavy visitation is a problem. Water quality and the quantity of water, partly due to climate change, is also a factor. And on the East Coast, primarily, acid rain is another huge factor impacting some of the parks. And the air pollution has a big impact on some of the parks And then climate change is also affecting these parks. If we look at climate change in Yellowstone, the temperatures in the park are higher now than they were 50 years ago, especially during the spring, and nighttime temperatures seem to be increasing more rapidly than daytime temperatures. So the growing season, which is the time between the last freeze of spring and the first freeze of fall, so has increased by 30 days, about a month. In some areas of the park, speaking of Yellowstone Park in this case, the northeast entrance, there's 60 more days per year that are above freezing than there were in the mid-1980s. One of the iconic species of the park, the grizzly bear. The grizzly bear depends on seeds that are found in the cones of white bark pine trees before they go into hibernation. This is a picture of the dead and dying white pine bark. And what's happening is the warmer temperatures have allowed this mountain pine beetle to move up to higher elevations. Historically, the white bark pine beetles were not an issue because they were killed by the really cold temperatures. But with increasing climate change, the temperatures are getting warmer, the season is warmer, and the mountain pine beetles have had a larger impact, killing huge areas of white bark pine, and that ends up having a catastrophic consequence for grizzly bears. Okay, because the typical diet of a grizzly bear varies from season to season, in the spring when the snow is melting, dead animals such as elk and bison, the carcasses of them become exposed as the snow melts, and bears will scavenge on these. And then in the early summer, they feed on spawning cutthroat trout. And cutthroat trout have actually been impacted by climate change as well because the warmer temperatures stress them out. Trout in general are a fish that need really, really cold water in part because it has more oxygen in it. And so the warmer water temperatures make it very tough for the respiration of trout in general, in this case particularly cutthroat trout. And in the late summer, bears to move to higher country to feed on moths, which feed on the nectar of alpine flowers. And then right before hibernation in the fall, they feed on the seeds from the white bark pines. And this part's critical because the seeds are very large and they're loaded up with fat and proteins. So they're very nutrient rich. And the grizzly bears eat these in large amounts to gain weight. And during hibernation, they use this energy stored up to make it through hibernation. So increased temperatures have resulted in increased mountain pine beetles at higher elevations, which have resulted in a large die-off of white bark pines, which have decreased the fall food source for grizzly bears, which means they're now entering hibernation in poor condition and they may not make it through hibernation. Another impact the parks are seeing is the absence of natural fires. There's an increase in the length of the fire season due to climate change. There's an increase in the number of fires, and there's an increase in the time needed to put out wildfires because they're significantly hotter than they were in the past. Another example of a fire in the West is the Rim Fire, which we mentioned, and this is in Yosemite, so not Yellowstone. So this is in California in Yosemite. And in 2013, the Rim Fire was California's third largest fire, and it burned for 2 months, and it burned 255,000 acres. And 77,000 of those acres were within the boundaries of Yosemite National Park. And this is a map that shows the fire history of Yosemite. And note the bright pink right here. And notice the little areas indicated bright pink that were burned between 1930 and 1969. And compare those with the areas burned between 2010 and 2018, which is the area sort of the turquoise color in blue. And so you see this huge increase in the area burned by wildfires between 2010 and 2018 compared to 1930 and 1969. Exotic species are also a problem. We've mentioned this before. Example in the Everglades in Florida, these Burmese pythons, which have been introduced into the Everglades, so they weren't there before. They have no natural predators, and they end up consuming all kinds of things, including endangered species of birds and mammals, and can potentially eliminate them. And another one that has done particularly well is red brome grass. You can see it growing between the Joshua trees here. And this is an area that is not fire adapted. Joshua Tree National Park at a higher elevation. So this red brome grass can potentially be the cause and part of fires that are not naturally occurring in this part of the desert. Wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995, and by 1997, all the wolves had tested for all the wolves that. So in 1995, there was a reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park, and by 1997, all the wolves were tested for diseases and had at least one infection, and those infections included canine distemper, canine parvovirus, canine herpes virus, and let's see what else. Canine herpes virus, yeah. And then in 2007, wolves inside the park started testing positive for mange, and that impacts animals that are stressed by other factors. And then, of course, there's also the absence of natural predators in many of these parks. I was just mentioning Yellowstone had wolves reintroduced, but many of the parks are missing their large apex predators, in part based on park size. We talked about this already, but many of the parks, if you see in this graph here, so many of the parks, if you look at this chart here, for example, that's not what I mean. In many of these parks, if you look at this table here, we discussed this already, but the far right column is the percent of original species lost. And you notice that only one of the parks, the one at the very bottom there in the Alaska region, has 0 species lost. Most of them have many lost. You can see right here, we're talking about Yosemite a second ago, 25% of the species have been lost, which is an effect in part due to these being ecological islands. Heavy visitor use is also an issue, and that's becoming more and more of an issue in the area. Parks are more urbanized. This is a picture of Yellowstone in the 1980s or so. This is a traffic jam in the 1990s going into Yellowstone, so the crowding is getting much worse than it was before. This is a picture of Old Faithful in Yellowstone, and it's a kind of an amazing thing to see. Old Faithful, you're packed in like crowds waiting for this geyser to go off, and now you see these large numbers of people going to visit this. And in part, that's a good thing. Hopefully, the idea that you have people that want to see these and travel to it, but it's the large number and the overabundance of people that are constantly there creating more pressure on wildlife that's an issue. Climate change and pollution that affect water quality and quantity are also an issue. So the National Park Service in Yellowstone, these small lakes and ponds are already beginning to dry up. And the problem with the cutthroat trout is the smaller the ponds get, it increases the water temperatures, and cutthroat trout are one of those species that don't do very well in warmer temperatures. They really need very, very cold water because cold water has more oxygen dissolved in it. And so warmer, even slightly warmer water temperatures are really hard on the survival of trout in general, but particularly in this case, cutthroat trout, which is again a food items for grizzly bears at certain times of the year. Air pollution is also an issue in the Grand Canyon. Here's a day with very little or no air pollution and one with lots of air pollution. So side by side, you can see the difference in just visibly what you see with the air pollution there. There's a coal fire powered plant that exists in Page, Arizona, and that's outside of the park, but depending on the activity of that plant, it can produce lots of air pollution, and depending on the winds, that can affect different parts of the region. So the Grand Canyon gets pollution from the south and the southwest, and then there's even in Nevada, depending on directions of the wind, once again, you can get these different areas producing the smog or producing the pollution that can affect surrounding regions based on wind patterns. Acid rain is also a problem, particularly on the East Coast, where water in the atmosphere combines with pollution, and it created from the burning of coal or oil or gasoline or other hydrocarbons. And the acid rain affects the landscape in a number of different ways. It also causes eggshell defects in birds, which reduces the reproduction in birds and can lead to a huge decline in bird populations. This is a picture in the Great Smoky Mountains in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. And according to air quality experts, each year the amount of acid deposition of sulfur oxides in the Great Smokies is comparable to 200 railroad cars spilling sulfuric acid in the park. And this has had huge effects on the park's ecosystem. And it's one of the most serious of threats to the Smoky Mountains National Parks and other parks in this region. Okay, so we're going to stop there for now, and I hope everyone's having a good day, and I will talk with you all soon.